is a direct lender.
Hannah.
Hi.
We offer quick closing and over 30 hours. Don't hesitate. Get this low rate. Call Drew. That's what we do. Hey, you. Yeah, you.
Hey, Jeff.
That's easy. You are plugged in.
Mm-hmm.
There were like 9 games.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
Hey, Sandra.
Because everything we do is about saving you money. Don't buy auto. The 80% off this price with 12 years of reliable service, millions of parts.
It says record.
We're still gathering. When the presentation starts, we'll be putting everyone on mute, and you'll be able to ask questions by raising your hand, which is in the list of participants. If you click on that, and underneath that is the option to raise your hand, or you can ask something in the group chat session. I'll be mentioning that as we go through this again. I see people are taking pictures of our session.
Never mind.
Good one for the newsletter. Raise hand.
Hi, Ben.
Hey, Carl.
I will be, so I'm making co-host. And Joe Korn will be here, and he'll also be a co-host, and we'll be watching the chat session and helping with the microphones and so on through the session.
Okay, thank you.
And let's hope that the storms get done before 2 o'clock.
Agreed.
Hello.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Bobby.
Hey, Bobby.
Hi.
Hello.
I hope we don't lose a tree this time.
Sounds like a good goal.
Did it go on your house?
No, just missed it by, I don't know, maybe 2 feet, something like that. It was really close.
Oh,
2
wow.
trees, actually. They both missed.
Thank God.
Yes. But we have some other big ones right nearby, so I'm very nervous about them.
Hmm.
Right now, my neighbor has a crew over there cutting down some trees, and I'm like hoping that he takes the one that's nearer my property.
Yeah.
But we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, we're going to get the others taken down, but he has to come back, so.
Hopefully they finish their work before the wind comes.
Trees are wonderful, but they're scary at times.
They are.
Well, the last tree he lost fell not on his property. It went over onto mine, but it landed on top of two of my maple trees. It never hit the ground. It was up there.
Oh my gosh, that was
And
lucky.
unfortunately, it killed my 2 maple trees. I ended up having to pay to have them taken down because they were just.
Yeah. Oh, you had to pay to get them taken. That doesn't seem right.
Oh, if it lands on your property, it's yours.
Okay, Linda, I set it up for you.
That has happened now, more than once. The problems of having a couple of yards.
Linda, I set it up for you.
Then it says you are using the computer on.
Hi, Judy.
I want to, right?
I joined without audio, I mean without video. Audio.
Don't I want to listen?
So Joe, I've made
What did
you,
you hold up?
sorry?
Oh, Jeff held up a sign, but I couldn't read it. No?
We're in.
Tell me if this is going to bother you. Yeah.
It's backwards. You have no audio.
And I don't see amongst the vast majority of the folks that I talk to, and I don't think
Jeff, try it now. Can you hear us?
Hey, Zelda.
Hi, everybody.
Hi. Hi, Paul.
How do?
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hi, Anna. Nice to see you,
Good to see you too. It's good to see everybody.
isn't it?
Carl, how do you scroll down so you can see everybody?
With the, just hover over the participant list, and then you can, or I mean, do you want to see everybody visually?
I'll
Yeah, I wanted to see their faces.
check with Bobby. She's
Hi,
downstairs.
Barbara.
Oh, Joe's gonna come help me. Okay.
Tell us all how to do that.
I have a
Yeah, pick up
arrow.
the computer and shake it.
I have an arrow.
Excuse me, Pat was trying to say something.
I have an arrow on the right side of the
pictures, and if you click that, it says a half, and it goes to a third, then it eventually shows you all of them. At least that's how my
The
computer.
arrow?
Sorry.
Mine says host disabled attendee screen sharing.
See another screen. No,
It's not on the bottom, it's on the upper
left click.
third of all the photos on
What?
the right side.
Yeah, that's what Pat just said.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a blue square with a white arrow. If you click it, it will
We
go
can
down
do
and
it
show
too.
everybody.
Yeah, there you go.
Oh.
One of two, two of two.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank
There's,
you.
there's only two screens. But if more people get on, there might be more screens.
Oh, I see.
Hello, everyone.
So right now, 5 people at a time.
Hey.
Hi, how are you?
Thank you.
I can't hear you. What?
We need help.
Yeah.
You came this morning.
Oh,
You can't talk to each other. Oh, where's it?
Yes. And then we create some. Run up again. Yeah, this too.
Well, that's great. Oh. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, we disappeared. But we're not. I don't know where we are. Maybe I could have-
Yeah.
Oh, there we are. Now we're up there. I'm
Ben.
like,
Oh,
I
that's
thought
really neat.
we are.
You registered.
We're about 2 minutes of, and we'll be starting in a little bit. And Joe, you're going to do the introductions?
Yeah, I can do the remarks if you like. I see Ben there. Are you all set, Ben? Everything good?
Could be, yeah.
Okay. I'll make a few very brief opening remarks and then you're good to go.
Inside.
Ah.
That's right on.
Doris. Collins out.
Hello, Ann.
Hi.
Paula.
Hello.
Hi.
I'll be muting everybody.
Hi, Paula.
Yeah, I'm joining from my phone, so I don't get to see, everybody.
Oh, that's why your picture's not on there.
Picture should be on from the phone. Okay, there it is. From the phone, I've got a picture.
Put over the side of the thing.
My laptop, I don't.
How you doing?
Okay, okay. You?
Good.
Oh, Nancy got on. Hi, Nancy.
I get an A for today, thanks to my teachers.
Hi, Diane.
Hey, Nancy, nice to see you.
Nice to see everybody.
Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Diane.
Diane.
Mhm.
Paula.
Hi, Josette.
Hello.
He's nice.
That's so cool.
MJ.
Do that.
It's 1 o'clock. Are we ready to start?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm gonna get started right now.
Do we mute ourselves? Or
I'm gonna try to, let me see if you wanna pop up here.
Hi, Jim and Joan.
Hi,
How you doing?
good, thank you.
Can't see you, but we can hear you.
See you, Maureen.
You're great, thank you.
Name.
Oh, at some point, right now, they can mute. At some point, they mute it.
I can't seem to find my mute. Why don't you mute everyone but me and Ben, and then we'll get started. We good? Okay. Well, thanks very much for joining the session. Just a couple of quick remarks. Everyone has been muted, so Ben can do his presentation. However, Carl and I are monitoring the session, so if you'd like to leave a message, you can use the chat line, and you can leave a text message to everyone, so everyone can see your message. Or if you want to raise your hand under the chat line, there's a raise a hand button, and then we can recognize you and unmute you and let you make your question or comment whenever Ben is ready to receive comments. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ben. Ben Realton is one of our newer instructors, has done some excellent courses that I've attended, mostly over at Southgate. He's also going to be doing a course this summer. And his talk today is called Of Thee I Sing, Competing Visions of American Patriotism. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ben.
Okay, thanks very much, Joe. Thanks to Carl for helping make all of this happen, and to everybody at WISE for offering these remote, digital, virtual versions of our conversations, of our work, the important work that we're not getting to do in person right now. Sorry about last week, sorry about the postponement, very stormy day. Today's gotta be, I guess, but hopefully we'll get this in before the hail or whatever else it is that's coming our way, frogs, locusts, whatever is next on the radar. But I'm very glad to be chatting with you all today and talking a bit about this newest project of mine. The title of this talk that Joe just mentioned is the same as the title of the book that is hopefully going to be coming out sometime by the end of the year on this topic of different forms of American patriotism. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit today about just kind of overall the 4 different types that I decided to focus on, that I identified and wanted to focus on, and thinking about different forms of American patriotism. I guess I'll talk a little first about just kind of my interest in that overall, how I came to that, and then get into these 4 types a little bit with examples of all 4 from one particular work, which is the song America the Beautiful. It actually has 4 verses that really follow the 4 types of patriotism that I'm highlighting. And so that makes for, I hope, a kind of clear way to highlight these 4 types. And then I'm actually just going to share one little snippet of the book, just a couple paragraphs, because I think it really helps highlight some of the kind of an example anyway of a case study of a very particular moment that we can see a little bit differently, which is a big part of the point of how I tried to apply these, is to use them to look at our history a little bit differently through the lens of these different types of patriotism. I also want to apologize if I'm a little out of sorts. We just got the news like 5 minutes ago that school in Massachusetts is canceled for the rest of the school year, which was the right decision. It's the thing to do, but my sons are super upset about that. For some reason, they really love school. Maybe it has something to do with their deeply nerdy father. And so they're a little bit bummed about that, and we've just been kind of dealing with that. But again, happy to be here chatting with you all about this other important way that we can keep learning too. So, as you might know, if you've taken classes of mine, one of my main interests for the last few years was in definitions of America, different ways that we define this place, this community, this identity of American identity. And my last project, which I gave a class that was sort of directly inspired by, was focused on that, was focused on particularly what I called exclusionary and inclusive definitions, competing definitions and visions of how we think about this place, this community. But for at least as long as I've been interested in that, and maybe even a little bit before I really developed that interest, I've also been thinking a lot about the idea of patriotism, this concept, this idea of a patriotic love of country or embrace of country or connection to one's country, one's nation, and how that too, I think, is a concept that, like America, I've argued and would argue, we have kind of one definition that we often seem to use when we talk about patriotism. And I have increasingly come to feel that that definition is only one of the many different possible ways that we can think about patriotism. And even more than that, as I'll try to get into a little bit in these few minutes, I would say that the definition that we tend to focus on, the one that we often mean when we use the word patriotism or talk about the concept, is not only just one of the different possibilities, but can really lead to a pretty destructive version, or at least a divisive version, and I would argue often a destructive version. So I've come to feel that it was really important to push back on that definition of patriotism that is the kind of often used or implied one, both to highlight the other possibilities and especially to highlight what I would say are possibilities that are not just as divisive or destructive, or at least can offer different ways of thinking about not only patriotism, but our community, our nation, our own participation in and relationship to those things. So that's a bit of kind of how I've come to this and why I've been interested in it. It really does parallel the idea of trying to define or redefine America, this community. But I also think even more than that focus, a focus on patriotism is really about what we all can do, how we all can kind of be part of those communities. And that makes it feel even a little bit more, I hope, participatory. It makes it really feel like it's connected to our role, all of our roles individually and collectively in the present, in the future, and in looking back at our past, which is what I do in this project. So, as I said, I started with kind of this one version of patriotism, and it's a version that I would call celebratory. And that's the first of the four types that I highlight, is the idea of a celebratory form of patriotism. And that's, again, I think the type that we most often mean when we talk about this concept. And so a celebratory form of patriotism is the kind that would perform rituals to celebrate the nation, like singing the national anthem with Hand Over Heart, or students reciting a Pledge of Allegiance at the start of a school day. These kind of rituals are examples of how we express that celebratory vision, that vision of the nation as something to be celebrated, as an ideal that we are members of and that we are proud of and supportive of and want to celebrate. And I think that, again, very often is the implicit version of what we mean by patriotism, is those forms of celebration and that idea of the nation as something to be celebrated, as something idealized and to be proud of and celebrated. And one thing I try to argue throughout the book is that by itself, that celebratory version, and I'll give you an example of it from the song in a couple minutes, that celebratory version I don't think has any necessary problems. There's nothing wrong with wanting to celebrate a community that we are all part of. It's a natural instinct, it's a human instinct, and it can be a really shared one. And that would be the goal, I think, of a celebratory patriotism. Ideally would be that it can link everyone, that it can bring together all voices, all participants, all members of a community for that celebration, as part of that celebration. But I would say there are a couple limits. There are a couple problems with that celebratory form of patriotism, particularly with the fact that we only, I think, when we say patriotism, almost always mean that one form, that one vision. And both of those lead to the kind of second and third main categories that I talk about a lot in this project. So one limit, and I think it's a particularly important limit right now in 2020 to be thinking about, is that in our history, that celebratory form of patriotism has very often been connected to what I would call myths of American identity. And so there's a second type of patriotism in the book that I call mythologizing patriotism, which is a form of patriotism that relies on and even creates these kind of mythic visions of the nation. And very often, if not almost always again, those myths of America are what I would call exclusionary. They leave out certain Americans, they leave out certain communities in order to emphasize a particular vision of American identity. One, for example, as we'll get to in the song in a second, which starts with, say, the Pilgrims in Massachusetts, in a way that leaves out entirely, for example, Native Americans and Native American communities as another part of an American story. And that myth, for example, that if that myth is what is being celebrated, it would make it much harder, if not impossible, for Native Americans to participate equally in those celebratory patriotisms, because they are not. That is not part of their heritage. And in fact, it is part of a heritage that very explicitly excluded those communities, discriminated against them, enacted violence upon them, and so on. So one problem with celebratory patriotism, I argue in this project, is that it can lead to or be connected to a second type that I would call mythologizing patriotism, a patriotism that relies on particular myths and even helps create particular myths of America. And very often those myths are exclusionary. They include certain Americans and histories and communities, but they exclude others. They leave out others. And that then makes it impossible in that form of patriotism for all Americans to really be equally part of those possible celebrations of that nation that is being celebrated. So that's the second type that I highlight in the project, and I'll talk more about in a second, mythologizing. And that's one limit, I would say, of the celebratory form, is that it can be very easily connected to that mythologizing form. But there's another problem with the celebratory form, and I think we've really seen this in the last handful of years as well, and of course throughout American history at times too, which is that through the celebratory vision, any criticism of the nation, any expression of anything negative or critical about the nation can be defined, can be seen as unpatriotic, as anti-American, as un-American, because it is not expressing that celebration. It's not expressing just that idealized vision. And so it becomes this dichotomy where you're either celebrating the nation or you are unpatriotic, anti-patriotic, outside of the nation. It's the idea of the phrase, love it or leave it, for example, or my country, right or wrong. And these are not limited just to America, of course, but we have very specific American versions of that narrative, of any criticism, any critical perspective as unpatriotic, un-American, anti-American, because it is not that one celebratory version. So a third category that I try to define and argue for in the book is instead the idea of critical patriotism, of a version of patriotism that criticizes, challenges, highlights flaws or failures or negatives in the nation, in its history, in its community, in its identity, but does so in order to try to strengthen the nation, to move it closer to its ideals, to make it more the better and best version of itself. And that, I would argue, is just as much a form of patriotism, but it is what we would call more of a critical form. And I'll highlight an example of that in a second from both the song and then beyond that too. So that's a third category that I highlight. So there's celebratory, there's the more divisive, exclusionary, mythologizing kind, the second kind. And then there's this idea of critical patriotism, of patriotism that offers a very different perspective on the nation, but out of patriotic goals. And then there is a fourth kind, which is somewhat connected to me to the critical one, although it doesn't have to be. And that was something I wanted to highlight when I started to think about how patriotism gets expressed. And so I came to realize that sometimes it's what we might call more passive forms of patriotism, such as participating in rituals, like singing an anthem or reciting a pledge. And again, not that there's anything necessarily wrong with those performances, but they are somewhat passive. They are things we are asked to do or that we do because those around us are doing them, et cetera. And so I also wanted to think in the project about what I came to call active patriotism. And by active patriotism, I mean in various moments and ways, individuals or communities who are more actively doing something, taking action in order to move toward a patriotic goal or express a patriotic goal, move the nation in one way or another. So for example, if we think about a recent story that was in the news a lot a couple years ago, Colin Kaepernick and his protests when he was an NFL player, a quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers, he certainly was expressing a critical patriotic perspective. He was criticizing aspects of race and inequality in American history and present. But I would argue what he really most was exemplifying was the idea of an active patriotism by taking action, and by taking action in direct relationship to a celebration, the national anthem performances before NFL games. I think that's an example of active patriotism, of explicitly using his body, his actions to express a different vision, a vision that he argued, and I would also argue was still in service of American ideals, still patriotic. But again, not the celebratory kind, and instead more an active patriotic expression connected certainly to more of a critical patriotic perspective on the nation, an attempt to move it closer to its goals. So when I have these four categories in play, I do kind of pair them. And I would say that celebratory is often connected to mythologizing, and that active patriotism is very often critical, because very often those actions are taken in an attempt to change something, to challenge something, to move the nation in one way or another. And they don't always have to line up that way. I try to move across different examples in the book. But roughly, I would say those are the four types, and that's roughly how I would pair them. Celebratory, and then this more extreme and divisive version that I would call mythologizing patriotism. And then critical patriotism, and one way that it is often expressed, which is in these active patriotic moments and actions. So those are the 4 types overall. To talk a little bit more about what I mean by them, I wanted to just use the lyrics to the song America the Beautiful, which I'm going to pull up on my phone here so I can quote them quickly. Because as I mentioned, America the Beautiful in its full form, when it's performed, it's usually just the first verse often, but in its full form, there are 4 verses that were written actually by a Wellesley professor, Catherine Lee Bates, who was a professor at Wellesley University. She wrote this poem first in the 1890s. She was traveling the US by train and began to write this poem about the United States that became the lyrics that were eventually set to music by her and an accompanist for this song known as America the Beautiful around the turn of the 20th century that has, of course, continued to be a part of our national patriotic expressions ever since. And again, if we look at the 4 verses, not just the first verse that is the most familiar, but the 4 verses, I think they actually line up with these 4 types of patriotism that I'm arguing. So just to give you these quick examples to say a little bit more what I mean, and then I'll just read one quick short part from the book, and then we can keep talking. So the first verse, the most familiar one, I think, is very much an example of a celebratory patriotism, a kind of extreme idealized vision of the nation, but one that everybody could participate in. That is just a celebration of an idealized perspective on America. And these are the lines that are most familiar. So, oh, beautiful for halcyon skies. And halcyon even just literally means sort of like heavenly, like an ideal vision of something. Halcyon skies for amber waves of grain, for purple mountain majesties above the enameled plain. And it goes on from there. But those first 4 lines, again, very overtly celebratory, right? Kind of extreme, exaggerated, hyperbolic descriptions, kind of based on reality. Yes, the waves could look amber. Yes, the mountains could look purple, but a kind of especially beautiful vision of them, especially celebratory vision. And again, words like halcyon, idealized, heavenly, majesties. So that first verse, I think, is a good example of just a celebratory, patriotic perspective, celebrating a kind of idealized version of America, in this case, through its kind of natural landscape and beauties that Gates was seeing as she traveled the US. So that first verse kind of lines up with the idea of celebratory patriotism. The second verse, and again, the second through the 4th are perhaps less familiar, but they all were part of her original poem and the original song. The second verse gets a little bit more into what I'm calling that mythologizing form of patriotism through its references to the Pilgrims. And so she writes in that second verse, "Oh, beautiful for pilgrim feet, whose stern impassioned stress a thoroughfare for freedom beat across the wilderness. America, America, God shed his grace on thee, till paths be wrought through wilds of thought by pilgrim foot and knee." And so again, this is another part of her celebration, is that she's focusing on the Pilgrims as part of an origin point. And that in and of itself is a choice that, of course, is somewhat exclusionary, but it gets even more so if we think about the people who were, say, in New England, in Massachusetts, when those Pilgrims arrived. If the Pilgrims are beating a thoroughfare for freedom across the wilderness, that entirely leaves out those communities that were present in that place already, and with whom, of course, the Pilgrims and Puritans had immediate, important, lasting relationships, positive, negative, and everywhere in between. And so this second verse, while it's still part of the celebration, focuses on a history, on a vision of history that is limited and excludes an entire community, many communities of Americans, in order to create that history and that part of the celebration. So that's certainly more an example of what I would call a mythologizing patriotism, creating or participating in the creation of a particular myth of America. It's certainly a part of America's history, of course, but defining a kind of American origin, a celebratory origin that is ultimately excluding other Americans and other communities in order to help create that myth, that mythologizing narrative. So that's at least a little bit more of what I would call that form of mythologizing patriotism, her second verse. But then she has her third and fourth, and they take us to the third and fourth categories that I'm trying to highlight here. So the third, for example, is I think a really interesting vision of an active patriotism through her reference to Civil War veterans in particular, or Civil War soldiers and veterans, Union in particular. And so she writes in that third verse, "Oh, beautiful for glory tale of liberating strife, when once or twice for man's avail, men lavished precious life. America, America, God shed his grace on thee, till selfish gain no longer stain the banner of the free. So again, referring to another part of American history, the at that time recent Civil War, and particularly the sacrifices of the Union and Union soldiers, in particular, those who lavished their precious life for man's avail, for freedom, in that liberating strife. And so that, while it still, of course, is connected to a particular vision of history, also is really connected to the idea of what those soldiers did, of their active patriotism, that glory tale of their service, of their sacrifice on behalf of American ideals, on behalf of the banner of the free. So I think that's a really interesting example of a vision of active patriotism, of Civil War service, Union soldiers' service and sacrifice as an expression of their active patriotism, an expression of their ideals, their American ideals and the American ideals they connect. So that third verse, I think, is an example of that. And then the fourth verse is a quick and definitely very implied, but I would say certainly still starting point for thinking about more critical patriotism, even in a song that is much more celebratory overall. And so in the fourth verse, Bates writes, "Oh, beautiful for patriot dream that sees beyond the years, thine alabaster cities gleam undimmed by human tears." And so I think even just a little reference there to a future that is better than the present, because the implication, I would argue, is that in the present, there are such tears. In the present, there are still inequalities, there are still challenges, there are still failures. And this was written at the depths of the Gilded Age in America, when there were many such inequalities and failures. But she has this patriot dream that sees beyond the years towards something better, toward a version of the nation that doesn't have those same tears or those same reasons for tears. And so I think in a very brief way, but in a definite way, I would call that a form of critical patriotism, acknowledging the flaws or failures or limits of the present, but imagining in a patriot dream a future that can move beyond them, that can move towards something better. And of course, part of the follow-up would be the idea of how to get there, which would be the arguments for change, for reform, for improving, for trying to move the nation in those directions. She doesn't get into those in one brief verse of a song, but that's the follow-up to a vision of a better future that can move beyond the present's tears, the present's failures or flaws or limits. And so I think briefly that's an example in that fourth verse of the song of the idea of something better in the future. And this is all connected in various ways to her specific historical context, the specific moment that she's writing these, including the moment of the Columbian Exposition in 1893, the World's Columbian Exposition, which was itself a vision of a better future in various ways, the white city of the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893. But also, I would argue, through the four verses of this song, we see these four different overall types, not just her specific context, the landscape she saw, the aftermath of the Civil War, and so on, but these broader ways of thinking about America, of thinking about how we define it and how we express our patriotism. More celebratory, connected more to mythologizing versions of our history and identity, more active in service and sacrifice, and then more critical even, in imagining a future that can move beyond some of the present's and past's limitations. So those are the four types that I highlight overall. In the project overall, what I do is I take that broad frame and I connect it to 8 different historical moments and try to think about examples of the 4 types in those different moments to really hopefully sort of turn a new lens on American history, starting with a chapter on the Revolution and then moving up to the last chapter, which is on the 1980s. And then there's a conclusion, a kind of aftermath on the 21st century on our present moment. And so across these chapters, I look at a lot of different particular histories, I hope through somewhat new eyes, through somewhat new lenses by thinking about these different forms of patriotism. So for example, and then I'm gonna just read one bit of one chapter in a second, but for example, I think one interesting way to reframe the revolution that we don't often talk about in our kind of historical memories or narratives is to think about the loyalist voices, those voices and communities who argued for the United States not existing, for America as colonies remaining loyal to England, as not just, say, English or traders, which is some of the ways that community has been defined, but in that early revolutionary, pre-revolutionary, and revolutionary moment as expressing a different patriotic narrative of American identity. And so I call them an example, a really complicated example, of critical patriotism, because they were arguing against the revolutionary perspective, arguing against those voices, arguing for a different vision of America's identity and future, in a way that challenged some of the narratives that were developing of the revolution and of American ideals and its founding document. So that's one just quick example of how I try in that chapter to use these different categories to kind of think about how we remember and how we tell the stories of these histories and these figures. Another example, to take it up to a more recent one, in my 1960s chapter, which is the 7th of the 8 chapters that I moved through, I think a lot about the narratives around protest and social movements and social reform, because that was such a part of the story of the 60s, but also such a pivot point in terms of how we think about patriotism. The civil rights movement, for example, I think very often expressed really powerfully critical patriotic perspectives of the nation. Martin Luther King Jr. really consistently made that case, arguing for a better version, an ideal version of America through criticisms, through critiques of its present, of its past, of its failures, of its limitations. But then a particular example of a myth in the 1960s, which I think is a really powerful example of how the mythologizing form of patriotism can criticize, can turn into an attack on critical patriotism and see it instead as unpatriotic, as treasonous, is one of the myths that came to be associated with the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement, again, could definitely be defined, and I try to define it in the chapter, as a version of critical patriotism, arguing for a different possibility for America by criticizing the Vietnam War and many other related issues around it. But one reason why I think the anti-war movement was seen instead in many narratives as unpatriotic, as even anti-American, had to do with some of the myths that were created through a kind of more mythologizing narrative of American patriotism. And one of them is the myth of returning Vietnam War vets being spat upon, having protesters spit on them, particularly at airports. And that was a myth that developed very, very potently in the late 1960s and became a kind of dominant American story. And you can see it in a lot of different pop culture texts. So for example, at the end of the first Rambo movie, First Blood, the character of Rambo, who's a Vietnam vet, is having this moment where he's venting all the things that have happened to him, the traumas he's experienced. And along with the traumas of his service in Vietnam, equal to that is the trauma of returning home and being spat upon by protesters. It becomes a central trauma in that character's story as a Vietnam vet. But the scholars who've studied that story have found no contemporary evidence in the late 60s or early 70s of any such actions of protesters spitting on returning vets. There are no stories about it. There's no journalistic coverage of it. It doesn't come up at all. It only starts to be talked about a few years down the road in sort of memory, in collective memory, in the perspectives of individual vets, but also in the sort of larger cultural sense, like that First Blood story. And that doesn't mean that it didn't happen necessarily. Although again, there's no contemporary coverage of it that these scholars have found. But it does mean that at the very least, it's an example of the development of this narrative in order to attack those protesters, in order to see them as not just expressing a different vision, but fundamentally anti-American, un-American, attacking these American service men and women, attacking these veterans. And so I would argue whether it happened or not, and again, there's no evidence that it did, the use of it, the use of that story becomes a form of mythologizing patriotism, of expressing this either or, of either you're with us or against us. A protest is equated to an attack on soldiers, an attack on veterans, literally and figuratively spitting upon them. And so that narrative, I think, is a really powerful example of the creation, or at least the deployment, of one of these mythologizing forms of patriotism in order to create that either or dichotomy between celebration and unpatriotic behavior rather than critical patriotism. So then the last thing I'll share before we get to, I hope, some further conversation for at least another half hour or so, is I just wanted to share a little bit of one particular part of my text. Joe, can you tell me, can you all see this?
Sorry, can
you see text on the screen?
No, I cannot. Did you hit share it?
I did.
You have a, is that a PowerPoint?
No, it's just a Word document. It's okay, I'll just read it quickly.
Okay.
I'm just going to read this really quickly because it's one other really interesting example of rethinking a particular moment through these categories. This is just 2 quick paragraphs. And this is in chapter 5 of the book, which is about the kind of early 20th century, the progressive era, with a lot of focus on World War I, because it was in relationship to World War I that we saw a lot of the continued development of some of these narratives of celebratory and mythologizing patriotism versus these other possibilities. And so this is just a little snippet of that. And so I've been talking about the labor movement, but then I shift to another American community identified as and anti-American in the World War I era. In his December 7th, 1915 State of the Union address, President Woodrow Wilson painted a wide swath of immigrant communities with the brush of unpatriotic behavior in order to request a Congressional Espionage Act. And this is a quote from Wilson's State of the Union. There are citizens of the United States born under other flags, but welcome under our generous naturalization laws to the full freedom and opportunity of America, who poured the poison of disloyalty into the very arteries of our national life. I urge you to enact such laws, espionage laws, anti-espionage, at the earliest possible moment, and feel that in so doing, I am urging you to do nothing less than save the honor and self-respect of the nation. That's the Wilson quote, and back to me. Congress debated the idea for much of its next 2 sessions, and on June 15th, 1917, at the same moment when the first American soldiers were setting sail for France and the war, passed the Espionage Act, which made various forms of military and political subversion a crime, and gave the Postmaster General the authority to refuse to mail publications determined to be in violation of those crimes. The follow-up, the Sedition Act, passed on May 16th, 1918, which offered a series of amendments to the Espionage Act, made clearer still the association of any criticism of the government with these crimes, as the Sedition Act banned, quote, any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States or the flag of the United States. And that last clause of the Sedition Act is particularly striking because, as I argue in an earlier chapter of the book, the Pledge of Allegiance, as it was created by Edward Bellamy, was never intended as a legal statement or requirement at any time, but the Sedition Act made the expression of any negative sentiments about the flag a crime, which comes quite close to requiring that Americans indeed pledge allegiance to the flag legally. And now we can see the effects of this in that same era really powerfully. So even a brief glimpse at a few applications of these laws during World War I reflects the breadth of perspectives that could be and were defined as seditious, as unpatriotic. A silent film, for example, entitled The Spirit of 76, which is a 1917 silent film about the Revolutionary War, was seized by the government for portraying the English, who were now America's World War I allies, too harshly. And the film's producer, a Jewish American immigrant from Germany named Robert Goldstein, was sentenced to 10 years in prison for producing that film. At the sentencing, his judge, Judge Benjamin Bledsoe, told Goldstein, count yourself lucky that you didn't commit treason in a country lacking America's right to trial by jury. You'd already be dead. So again, this is the producer of a film about the Revolutionary War, convicted of sedition, convicted of treason under the Sedition Act and sentenced to 10 years in prison. That's a really explicit example of the effect of these kinds of mythologizing visions of patriotism, these visions of either or celebration or treason. And the film wasn't even critical patriotism. It wasn't even criticizing America. It was criticizing England. And yet it was still defined as treasonous and seditious under that law. And then just to highlight one other example from this paragraph, 8 members of a religious organization called the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society were also convicted under the Espionage Act based on charges which stemmed largely from the following sentence in their anti-war book, The Finished Mystery. This is a quote from this book that got them convicted under the Espionage Act. And yet, under the guise of patriotism, civil governments of the earth demand of peace-loving men the sacrifice of themselves and their loved ones and the butchery of their fellows, and hail it as a duty demanded by the laws of heaven. So in that anti-war book, that sentence, which argues that patriotism can be used to lead to war and the death and destruction that comes with war, was ruled to be seditious, was ruled to be treasonous, and defined as such legally, leading 8 members of that group to be convicted under the Espionage Act for publishing, for writing and publishing that book. So that's just one moment. It's just one particular historical moment. But I think what it highlights, I hope, as one example is not just these different categories, celebratory versus critical patriotism, but how much they're also always in tension, how much this is also about a dialogue and often a debate between these different visions, how we see not just America, but how we see our role in participating in that nation, and how very often that either or definition has led more critical perspectives, other perspectives, other visions to be defined not as another form of patriotism, but as outside of America, outside of patriotism, unpatriotic, anti-patriotic, un-American, anti-American. So while this project is trying to look across the different histories, trying to look at these different examples, there is ultimately an argument, I would say. And that ultimate argument is that we need to create space for the possibility of critical patriotism. Even if we personally don't agree with a particular act of it or expression of it, to create the possibility of that as an option, of critical and active patriotisms as equally patriotic, equally ways to express patriotic goals for America, perspectives on America, along with the more celebratory and perhaps always also the more mythologizing versions. Because otherwise what happens again is this schism, this split, where it's an either or, it remains that sort of us and them mentality, very much parallel to what I talked about in my last project with exclusion and inclusion. But here with this inability to see these other possibilities, these other ways of being patriotic, of taking patriotic action, of expressing a patriotic perspective. So ultimately that is a part of my overarching argument. But my first goal was just to think about these different possibilities, think about these different types, and use them as a lens to look at different historical moments, different American histories, and think about these different forms of patriotism that we can trace across them too. I'm going to stop there and say that there's obviously something like half an hour more here where I'm happy to keep the conversation going. I know some people have been raising questions already, and then we'll be happy to hear other follow-up thoughts or questions of any kind to keep talking about this. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you, Ben. If anyone has any questions or comments they would like to make, please raise your hand on the chat line, and we'll recognize you and unmute you and let you make a comment.
And Joe, I don't know if you saw, I know some questions came through already in the chat. If you want to maybe share those, I could look at them too, I know, but if you want to do that.
I'll read the comments. There was when you started talking about patriotism, I did reference a song called The Patriots Game. It was written by Dominic Behan in Ireland, and it was covered by, among other performers, Judy Collins and a Kingston Trio. And it takes an interesting view of patriotism during the Troubles in Ireland and a conflict with the IRA.
Mm-hmm.
So again, very conflicting views of what is patriotism and nationalism. Patsy Cecile made a comment that the Alabaster Cities in the fourth verse of America the Beautiful refers to the beautiful white marble exposition halls in the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. I think you also made that reference. And Carl Hakarenian noted that asked how do the utopian societies, particularly in the 19th century, fit into this patriotism matrix? And that was actually a question to you. If you'd like to.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I didn't, for whatever reason, I guess maybe my time periods didn't quite line up with the height of those utopian societies in the 1840s and 50s, when you have ones like Brook Farm right near me here, or Fruitlands further west in Massachusetts, and then many others around the United States as well. And yeah, I think that utopianism, it's interesting because it's another celebratory perspective. It's another kind of idealized perspective, but in this case of sort of human possibility, of the human world, rather than maybe just specifically the nation. And then in my last 2 projects ago, when I talked about critical patriotism, I also actually talked a bit about the idea of a critical utopianism, which are arguments for a utopia that also sort of depend really overtly on recognizing the failures in the present and then trying to move toward that utopia through kind of challenging the present failures. So I think utopianism really parallels to patriotism in some interesting ways. I think there's more celebratory versions of it. I think there's more critical versions of it. I think it is often sort of beyond just the nation. It's often more about a kind of overall human goal. But I would say it very much kind of lines up in terms of having these different possibilities, these different ways that utopian perspectives can sort of be expressed. So that's how I would first.
To kind of pick up on that, one of the things that really influenced my thinking about American history was Frederick Jackson Turner's writings about frontier and section, where he lays out the importance of the notion of the frontier for the American psyche, and how we have always seen this notion of endless possibilities as a core part of the American dream, if you will. Even though the census in 1890, as he wrote, effectively closed the frontier, it's never been closed in our psyche. So we have this deeply rooted notion of we can be anything, and sometimes that goes to the extremes of American exceptionalism, but it also can go inward in terms of finding land, reinventing some Edenic community, be it religious based or intellectually based, and going forward from there. And that's part of that runs through so much of American thought and culture, as well as the more robust, often masculine style of patriotism.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And in my second chapter, which is on the early Republic period, that early 19th century period, I try to tease out how even the same sort of figures can express these different versions. So for example, the phrase manifest destiny, that phrase for the idea of the expansion of the United States as this a destined future, was developed by this journalist named John L. O'Sullivan, writing for a magazine called the Democratic Review that he had helped start. And manifest destiny, I argue in that chapter, is pretty explicitly a kind of exclusionary mythologizing form because of the way it leaves out, for example, the Native communities, the Mexican American communities, the many other communities throughout the West that the US was moving into in that period. But that same figure, John O'Sullivan, also was a founding member of this movement called the Young America movement in the 1830s and 1840s and after. And the Young America movement, I argue in that chapter anyway, was much more a sort of active patriotism that was meant to be more democratic and all-encompassing, and one that Americans could participate in across different sort of communities and across different cultures and boundaries. And so I think it's really interesting to even think about how some of those different forms can exist within the same kind of moments, the same figures, the same arguments. And somebody like O'Sullivan is just one example of that in the project.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Donna Bickle asked a question, where would you locate Mark Twain's work broadly, and in particular, the War Prayer in your framework? Yeah, and there's an interesting question that's kind of implicit in the book. I'm not sure I quite say it explicitly, and I probably should as I try to finalize revisions of when critical patriotism gets dark enough or pessimistic enough that we might say it's not even quite patriotism anymore, it's more pure critique, and often righteous critique, justified critique. And I would say the writings of late Mark Twain, which are very dark, very cynical, very satirical, very angry, are right on that border where I'm not even sure by the end of Twain's career he was able to imagine a positive possible future a lot of the time. I think he saw just how ugly people, and Americans specifically, could be through things like imperialism and war, and the kind of most destructive versions of patriotic narratives in service of things like the war in the Philippines, which he writes about so angrily toward the end of his career. And so I would say those are sort of critical patriotism, but they're almost even just critique. I think he got to a point where he had abandoned a lot of the hope or the possibility in favor of really, again, righteously angry critiques.
attacks on things like war and imperialism as just expressions of the worst of humanity, the worst of us, churning up our young people, other parts of the world. And so there's not exactly a place for that in the project, because I'm not even sure I would call it patriotism exactly. It's just righteous anger and critique about the worst of what we can do. But there's obviously a place for that. It's really important. And I should at least make clear that it's the other end of the spectrum in a way, from, let's say, the most kind of blind celebrations, the ones that say my country right or wrong 100% of the time. The other end of that spectrum would be the ones that say, look how awful this thing is right now. Look how awful these moments are, which, optimist that I am, is a perspective that I find myself occasionally taking in April 2020, I will admit. So I think that whole spectrum is worth considering. And definitely, I think Late Twain falls pretty far along toward that righteous, angry critique perspective, kind of at that end. So I would think.
We lost your audio a little bit, but hopefully you're there. Jean, how would you compare your categories of patriotism with nationalism?
Another really good question. I think nationalism as a phrase, as a word, as a concept, is usually used, and I think I would agree with this, in a more overtly negative sense, or at least for something I would want to be critical of. And so I would say nationalism is maybe more an example of what I would call a mythologizing patriotism, an us versus them form of patriotism, an exclusionary form of patriotism. Because when I think of nationalism, I think of using the nation to oppose enemies, to oppose others, to oppose those who are defined as outside of that nation. Often, of course, people who are present in that nation, but who are seen as outside of it. And I think in America, a lot of the time that equates with white nationalism, white supremacist nationalism, although it doesn't have to. And so it doesn't have to be that that's what nationalism means. But that is often how I think about that term, is sort of exclusionary, mythologizing patriotism that uses the we to define those us, those thems, and those thems outside of the we. And in that case, I would say nationalism is one piece of patriotism, but I think it can be a very divisive and destructive one. Again, you could use the term in other ways, but when I hear the term nationalism, I tend to associate it with that kind of exclusionary, mythologizing, us versus them kind of patriotism.
Thank you. Maureen Gray asked, as you analyzed America the Beautiful, have you done a similar analysis to the standards of the national anthem?
I'm not in the same way, but I actually bring the national anthem into my Early Republic chapter as well, because it's written by Francis Scott Key during the War of 1812. And I use it as part of an argument that it's in that moment, in that Early Republic moment, that some of the more kind of full national celebrations begin to be really developed. The nation has had its revolution, it's begun to kind of exist as its own entity. And so things like the memory of the revolution around the 50th anniversary of the revolution and its activities start to be opportunities for more kind of full national celebrations. And I think the War of 1812, and specifically the Star-Spangled Banner that Francis Scott Key writes there in Baltimore Harbor, from a ship in Baltimore Harbor looking at that American fort, I think is another example of early Republic celebratory patriotism. But then it gets complicated, because there is verse 3, which is the verse that is very rarely talked about, but Colin Kaepernick tried to draw attention to it with his protests, because verse 3 is the one where Key is defining, in terms of the revolution and the War of 1812, is defining communities who are unpatriotic, who are opposed to the United States. And he defines the slave as one of those communities who are unpatriotic, who are opposed, referring at least a little bit to the kind of narrative that during the Revolutionary War, enslaved people joined with the British against the colonies. And so partly what the Star-Spangled Banner is, I think, is an early Republic example of celebratory patriotism, but it also includes some very complicated, I would say more mythologizing exclusionary patriotism with something like that third verse of Key's. And at the time, Key was a slaveholder himself. He would end his life opposed to slavery. But as of 1812, as of the War of 1812, he himself was a slaveholder. He had inherited his family's slaves in Maryland. So gets really complicated when you think about the Star Spangled Banner and the War of 1812. Celebratory patriotism, but also certainly some examples of, I would say, more mythologizing patriotism, especially when it comes to race and faith.
I lost your audio right at the end. Were you done answering that? Okay.
Yes, I was. Sorry. Yes.
Thank
Sorry.
you. Okay. Yeah, sometimes the internet gets a little bit unstable. Hopefully we can all in there.
Yes, it does.
Carolyn Howe wrote, thank you for talking about the myth of the spat upon Vietnam vet. I was an anti-war activist who was fighting to bring the boys home and save the Vietnamese. I cared about the vets and ended up marrying the man who wrote the book, The Spitting Image Myth of the Spat Upon Vietnam Veteran.
Oh, Jerry Lemke. I talk about that book a lot in that chapter.
During the Gulf War, Bush really creates this myth of spat upon vets to discredit any criticism of the war and the anti-war movement.
Yeah, I think that's one example of how important it is to me to create that space for critical patriotism. Because wartime, and obviously a lot of American history has been wartime, particularly the last 40 years, particularly the last 20 years, which have been continually wartime. Wartime is often this moment when that either or narrative gets deployed. You're with us or you're against us. Celebrate or nothing. And so a phrase like support the troops, for example, gets deployed only in terms of that version of patriotism. The only way to support the troops is to support the wars, support the US's actions no matter what. Whereas absolutely anti-war movements in World War I, in the Vietnam War, with the Gulf Wars, in the last 20 years, very often express what I would argue are patriotic perspectives, not only overall about American ideals, but about America's soldiers and an argument for their safety, for their well-being, for their survival. And so absolutely pushing back on that form of celebratory patriotism helps create that idea that there's room for a critical patriotism, even and maybe especially in times of war. So I think that is a huge example of why I think this, the stakes of these definitions are really high.
Yeah, and Bill Forbes' question or comment is very much in line with what you just said. He says, do these different varieties of patriotism serve different purposes? Can each variety serve multiple different purposes in different situations?
I think so. And I definitely don't want to argue, and I hope I made clear in these few minutes, and I hope I make clear in the book, I don't want to argue, for example, that celebratory patriotism is necessarily or inevitably a bad thing at all. I think there's real value in collective celebrations of something. There's real value in coming together and saying, we as a community are proud of our community, of each other, of the place that we're part of. I think there's huge value in that. And so I think celebratory patriotism, for example, can absolutely have that positive effect. And I think my ideal version of these would be that celebratory and critical can really overlap in that way then, where we can say there are times and places to express that communal pride. And then equally, there are times and places to criticize shortcomings to try to move the nation forward, rather than seeing them just again as opposed or separate. And I think the real issue then is that mythologizing form, which very often requires seeing critical patriotism as unpatriotic, as treasonous, because it doesn't line up with the myths, perhaps, or it doesn't line up with that one very particular narrative. So I do think these things can be at odds with each other, but I don't think celebratory and critical patriotism overall are mutually exclusive. I think they can coexist. And in fact, in the participation within a community, I think both are really valuable. Both can be really important. But right now, what's happened, I think a lot of the time, is that because we only tend to mean the celebratory form when we think about patriotism, it then leads very easily into those mythologizing ones, which don't create room for a more critical perspective. And that, I think, has been a lot of the issue that I try to trace across these.
Yeah, I think Patsy, Cecil just had a very similar comment. Can you speak to patriotism as it exists in our country today, as we are so divided right now as a nation?
Yeah, and one thing I tried to get at in a conclusion, talking about our current moment a little bit, is how much we still are caught in some of the same cycles that I saw across these historical moments. And one of the most prominent of those cycles is the idea that criticism is unpatriotic. And we've seen that, for example, last summer in a couple different contexts. One was the 1619 Project, the New York Times Magazine's project on the history of slavery and its aftermath, which was criticized from multiple directions as fundamentally anti-American, as just highlighting the worst of America, when the project itself over and over again links its goals to critical patriotism, to moving the nation forward, and actually argues in its opening essay by Nicole Hannah-Jones that African Americans have been among those who fought most fully, most consistently for American ideals, despite those legacies, or even in fact, maybe because of those legacies. So that's one example, again, in our present moment of this divide, and I would say of seeing something like the 1619 Project as a really great example of critical patriotism, rather than, again, just something outside of that conversation. And then another one that I won't talk about at length in the same way, but I think is certainly still present, is the way in which, again, say immigrant communities, other communities of Americans are defined. And so last summer, another thing that happened was the critiques, if we want to call them that, the attacks that the president, Donald Trump, levied against the Squad, the 4 Democratic congresswomen. And in his critiques of them, he explicitly defined them as foreign. He said that they should go back to the countries where they came from, which were these horrible places that needed help more than America, even though not all of them were born outside of the US, for just one of the many problems with that statement. But the bigger problem with that statement, again, was this idea that because they were criticizing him and his administration, and thus the United States in some ways, they were un-American, they were outside of America. They should go back to their places and deal with the problems there, rather than, again, expressing their critical patriotic perspective as Americans, as part of American society. So I think right now, a lot of the divisions are still between these different sides, seeing this either or mentality, rather than making room for the possibility that the goal is patriotism in these different forms, these different expressions. That's a lot of what I see still playing out in 2020 very, very fully.
Yeah, and Carl just made the comment, for all the expressions of celebratory patriotism, there are people in power who will agitate the public for their own purposes.
Yes.
A question from Carolyn Howe: do you think the anti-distancing protests expressed as patriotism, individualism, or liberty will grow and have a sticking power leading in the next into the next election?
It's hard for me. I want to understand. Part of my goal always as a public scholar of America and American studies is to try to be, initially anyway, sympathetic to different perspectives. And so I understand individuals and communities arguing for their own liberty, their own rights. But my problem with those protests right now is that they threaten the common good. They threaten the collective experience. They threaten the lives, quite literally, not just of each other, but of other Americans, of medical professionals, of the Americans around them and their communities. So it's very hard for me to see those, I guess I would call those protests mythologizing patriotism, because yes, they argue for a certain version of we, and they certainly use history to make that argument, quotes from the founding fathers, et cetera. But they do it by, it seems to me, leaving out so many other Americans from their concern. I don't think you could right now, unless you just 100% don't believe that what's happening in our society is happening, that the pandemic is real. I don't think you could gather in those ways if you weren't able somehow to not be concerned about many Americans, including, again, medical professionals and others in your community and others around you who might be infected, who you might infect, who could suffer. So again, I try to understand the arguments for one's own liberty that some of those individuals and communities are making, but I think they're doing it in a way that threatens our common society, that threatens the common good. And so I would have to call them a form of mythologizing patriotism that excludes many Americans in order to make the case for its particular vision. Is it going to catch on? Is it going to last till the election? Probably. I think a lot of things right now are going to continue to endure and be part of this debate. But I hope we can continue to, again, leave room for a perspective on America that is both more critical of where we are and still arguing for the collective common good as the ultimate.
I think there's a final comment here from Victor and Bunny, noting the remainder of the verse 4 offers an even more compelling alignment with critical patriotism, quote, mend thy every flaw and liberty in law.
Yes, mend thy every flaw. That's the goal. If I try to find optimism these days, other than in my sons out there in the other room and my students still trying to learn in these online settings, including here, if I have any reason for optimism, it's the idea that we have such a legacy of critical patriotism in America. So many figures, so many texts, so many moments, and I try in each chapter to highlight quick examples of that express that critical patriotic perspective, that help try to push us toward the best version. If we're gonna get to another side of all of this, we're gonna need those voices, those past ones for inspiration, the present ones all around us. We're gonna need to be able to hear them. We're gonna need to be able to see them as patriotic, rather than again, as unpatriotic or treasonous. There's no way we can move forward without that critical patriotism that can help us. That's my ultimate argument here, I guess.
Well, thank you, Ben. I think that's all the chat. I have a few comments that talked about what a wonderful talk it was and really appreciate it. So thank you very much. Two quick comments before we finish up. I would like to note that Ben is planning to do a course this summer. We're going to be getting a course catalog out about the summer classes very soon. But Ben's course is going to be American History in 5 songs. And we're going to have 5 different sessions. And I think Ben plans to covering a song each week. Also note that Martha Chicharo's session is tomorrow at 1 o'clock, and she's going to be doing Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper and talking about that wonderful painting. So hope to see many of you online tomorrow.
And to add to that, Joe, Martha's class has a wait list. So we're going to be streaming the presentation on YouTube Live. We'll be getting that link out to the people on the wait list tomorrow. So if you've signed up and you are on the wait list, you'll still be able to see and hear the presentation.
Yeah, Zoom allows up to 100 people to register for these sessions, and Martha exceeded the limit. So Carl has very kindly set up streaming on YouTube, so people who still want to see it can do that through YouTube. And again, want to thank Ben for his wonderful talk and Carl for all of the technical support that makes all of these sessions possible. So thank you all for that.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
We will see you tomorrow.
All right, take care. Be well, everyone.
Did you have something, Grace?
Yes, I want to know about tomorrow. Can anybody listen to that lecture on YouTube?
Yeah.
You don't have to register. I mean, there's no registration on that.
Right.
Are you going to tell us how to find it?
I will, because I haven't created the link yet, but I will make it available tomorrow morning.
Okay, thank you. There may be some people we could persuade to join WISE just by that.
I think that would be nice. So
Okay.
Thanks for the suggestion. Yeah, we'll get that link out tomorrow.
Thanks.
Great.
I'm leaving.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Spelling bee.
Okay. So have a good afternoon, folks.
Yeah.